Hello, friends. Do you think you know history? The kind that's chronicled in thick books where dates and names parade in neat rows? Forget it. Today you will hear about a quack surgeon who saved 16 lives by flipping through a textbook right during surgery. About a battle won by firing cannons loaded with pieces of old cheese. And about a scientist who consumed the mummified heart of a king simply out of gastronomic curiosity. Buckle up. We are heading to where facts sound like fiction and reality mocks any screenwriter. As is our tradition, please give this video a thumbs up and share in the comments from which city you are listening to us. This really helps grow our community. Let's begin. Story number 1. The Great Thorny Wall That History Preferred to Forget. Honestly, if I hadn't seen maps from the 19th century with my own eyes, I would think this was a plot for a bad fantasy novel. Seriously? We all know the Great Wall of China, right? Stone, grandeur, the cosmos. Now imagine there was another wall, almost as long, but made not of granite, but of bushes. Live, wicked, thorny bushes. And it sliced through one of the most densely populated countries in the world, right in half. Let's transport ourselves to mid-19th century India. Heat, dust, spices, and British colonizers who absolutely adored money. Back then, salt was not merely a seasoning. In a scorching climate without salt, you'd be a corpse. It's necessary to keep meat from rotting and to prevent people from fainting from dehydration. The British East India Company figured it out. If you control salt, you control life. They imposed a tax, a wild, extortionate salt tax applied to what was harvested from the sea. But there was a problem. In the depths of the continent, there was plenty of salt, and it was dirt cheap. Smugglers transported it by the ton, eluding checkpoints. What does a normal government do? Lower taxes? Strengthen law enforcement? No. The Brits decided, let's just block off all of India. Sounds like a joke, right? But they approached it with chilling seriousness. They named the project the Line of Internal Customs Control, a boring title for a madcap scheme. At first it was just ditches and piles of dried brush, but smugglers leaped over them, laughing in the faces of customs officials. Then someone had a brilliant and brutal idea. They started planting a living hedge. These were not tidy little bushes trimmed by gardeners in English estates. Oh no. This was a monstrous mix of Indian plum, acacia, cacti, and bamboo. The plants intertwined with branches, creating an impenetrable green barrier nearly 4 meters high and that very same 4 meters wide. The thorns were so sharp they could pierce through leather shoes. And do you know how long this thing was? 2,500 miles. Just think about that. 2,500 miles. That's the distance from London to Istanbul or from Moscow to Krasnoyarsk. And it was a continuous wall of thorns, tended by 12,000 people. 12,000 gardeners, police officers who watered, pruned, and patched up holes in this green monstrosity. It was the Great Indian Hedge. No person could sneak through, and not even a tiger could squeeze past it. Even snakes became ensnared in this thicket of thorns. It was perhaps the most monumental and absurd monument to bureaucracy ever in human history. Picture this scene. Thousands of miles of blazing sun, and in the midst of the plain stretches an endless ominous wall of bramble, patrolled by individuals ready to kill for a sack of salt. The impoverished were starving because they couldn't afford salt, while nature appeared to rise up against humanity, creating this barrier. It stood for almost 40 years. For 4 decades, this prickly noose choked the continent. And then, it vanished. By the end of the 19th century, the salt tax was finally made reasonable, and the wall was left to neglect. And here's the astonishing part. The nature that had been wielded as a weapon rapidly took back what was hers. Without care, the bushes withered, burned, were cut for firewood, or consumed by termites. Today, little remains of the great hedge. No bricks, no plaques. Just old maps in dust-laden offices in London, and rare mentions in the memoirs of travelers who noted the green scar on India's face. We have forgotten it, just as we forget a bad dream. But the earth remembers. And you know what's most peculiar? Sometimes, while wandering through the Indian countryside, one can stumble upon a strange strip of unnaturally dense shrubbery that grows in a perfectly straight line, as if drawn with a ruler. The locals have long since forgotten why it exists. It is an echo of a time when greed prompted people to build a wall from the sea to the mountains solely to prevent others from salting their rice for free. By the way, for those curious, I left links to all the primary sources in the description. Check them out. Now, let's move on. Story number 2. A surgeon who learned to cut while cutting. Listen, we're accustomed to the idea that professionalism is built on years of cramming, diplomas, sleepless nights with textbooks, and trembling hands during first exams, right? That makes sense. You wouldn't board a plane if you found out the pilot learned to fly only by playing video games the night before. You wouldn't lie down under the knife of a surgeon who had only carved up a turkey for Christmas. Or would you? Let's transport ourselves to 1951, the Korean War. The cold, gray sea where a Canadian supply ship, the Cayuga, sways. On board, the scent of iodine and fear lingers. A boat approaches carrying wounded South Korean soldiers, 16 in total. And they look, to put it mildly, in terrible shape. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel embedded in their chests, ruptured abdomens. They need surgery, right now, or, in an hour, they'll be unceremoniously tossed overboard in bags. All eyes turn to the ship's doctor. His name is Joseph Sire, a charming and calm man with intelligent eyes. The crew adored him. He treated their dental issues. Yes, he could do that. He set dislocations, provided cough medicine. But this situation doesn't involve a cough. It's a rib cage mangled by lead. The captain looks at the doctor with hope. "Save them, Doc." The doctor nods. He instructs them to prepare the operating room and rushes to his cabin. Why? To pray? To drink for courage? No, he dashes to read, because the man everyone called Dr. Joseph Sire was, in fact, Ferdinand Waldo Damara. And he didn't just lack a medical diploma, he hadn't even completed school properly. He was a brilliant imposter who stole the identity of a real doctor, forged documents, and joined the Navy simply to escape his past. Imagine this moment. You're in a cabin, people are dying outside, and you're frantically flipping through a military field surgery textbook, trying to remember where, for heaven's sake, the lung is, and how not to slice through the aorta. Any normal person would have had a heart attack from fear, but Damara was anything but normal. He possessed a frightening supernatural memory and an utter absence of fear. He entered the operating room, told the nurses, "Let's get started," and began cutting. It sounds like the plot of a dark comedy, but it's true. He was opening the chest of a soldier while glancing at the pictures in the book he had opened to the side. He removed a bullet lodged millimeters from the heart. He stitched up wounds. He administered penicillin in doses that would make modern doctors faint, simply because he feared infection more than side effects. He operated for 48 consecutive hours without sleep. Do you know how many patients died? 0. Not a single one. All 16 soldiers survived. The imposter, who learned surgery in the middle of the operation, performed a miracle that even some professors could not achieve. Word of the miracle doctor spread instantly. He was featured in newspapers. The mother of the real doctor, Joseph Sire, read an article, saw a picture, and said, "Wait a minute, that's not my son Joe." The deception was uncovered. The Canadian Navy was furious, yet simultaneously shocked. How? How had this guy, who had previously been a monk, a prison guard, and a teacher, also with fake diplomas, managed to perform such complex surgeries? The ship's captain refused to turn him in for a tribunal. "I will not judge a man who saved so many lives," he declared. Damara was simply quietly dismissed and asked to disappear. By the way, do you think he calmed down? Of course not. Later, he served as the deputy warden of a prison in Texas and, reportedly, was quite good at it until he was recognized again from a magazine photo. Ferdinand Damara proved a strange and uncomfortable truth. Sometimes a diploma is just a piece of paper, and audacity can be a second chance, or even the first. But, honestly, I would still prefer my surgeon to study textbooks before picking up a scalpel, not during the anesthesia. Story number 3. The man who didn't sink, even when he tried hard to. Have you ever felt like a failure? You know, when the day just doesn't go right, you spill your coffee and the bus leaves without you. If that's the case, let me introduce you to John Bebekumba Ali, a man whose misfortune was so epic that it ultimately saved his life. Although it depends on how you look at it. Maybe it was the executioner who was unlucky? The late 19th century, England, an era of fog, top hats, and a justice system that did not favor long deliberations. John Ali was accused of the cruel murder of a wealthy lady for whom he worked as a servant. The evidence was shaky at best, primarily circumstantial. He had a cut on his hand. He was the only man in the house. In general, the jury was satisfied. The verdict? Death by hanging. John swore he was innocent. God knows I didn't do it, he insisted. But the judge merely nodded and struck the gavel. A date was set, February 23rd, 1885. The Ector Prison. Hanging. The procedure is technical, almost engineering-like. There is a trap door in the floor, a rope, and a lever. The executioner, James Barry, was a professional. He tested the mechanism the day before, lubricated the hinges, placed a sandbag on the trap door, pulled the lever, and the trap door opened. The bag fell. Everything worked perfectly, like Swiss clockwork, but only for execution. The morning of the execution arrives. John Ali is taken outside. The priest mutters a prayer. John's hands are tied. A hood is placed over his head, and the noose is thrown around his neck. He stands on the trap door. His heart pounds in his throat. The executioner pulls the lever. And nothing happens. The trap door doesn't open. John stands there. The crowd freezes. The executioner yanks the lever again. And again. The trapdoor seems welded shut. John shuffles on the spot, hearing the creaking of the structure beneath him and the frustration of the executioner. He is taken down from the gallows and led back to his cell. The executioner, in a fury, calls for a carpenter. They check the mechanism, place the sandbag again. The trapdoor opens. They jump on it themselves. It works. John is brought out for a second time. Again, a prayer. Again, the hood over his head. Again, the noose, the lever, and again, silence. The trapdoor remains steadfast, not even twitching. John Lee stands on it like a monument to himself. At this point, even the prison chief begins to feel uneasy. Whispers of divine intervention circulate among the crowd. But the law is the law. The order to hang is still in place. The mechanism is checked once more. The boards are planed, believing they might have swelled from moisture. The hinges are examined. Again, the sandbag drops down with a swoosh. The third attempt. John Lee is probably not afraid anymore, just exhausted. He finds himself back on the gallows. The executioner, red with shame and anger, leans on the lever with all his weight. Nothing. The trapdoor beneath John Lee has become the most reliable surface on earth. At that moment, even the priest's nerves gave way. The prison doctor said, "Enough. We can't execute a man 3 times in one day. This is torture." John was taken back to his cell. The execution was cancelled and replaced with life imprisonment. And here's the most interesting part. Engineers later pondered over this mystery. There were theories about the rain causing the boards to swell only under the weight of a person, not the sandbag. There were speculations about the hinges being misaligned, or that the prisoners who built the gallows had sabotaged it cleverly, but no exact answer was ever found. The mechanism worked perfectly before and after John, just not with him. John Lee served 22 years, was released, married, and moved to America, where he eventually died of old age. A man whom the British Empire could not kill. It is said that in prison, he loved to tell this story to his cellmates, always adding, "Apparently God had plans for me, or the devil just had a breakdown of the elevator to hell." Story number 4. A woman who gave birth to rabbits and deceived a kingdom. In the realm of medicine, there are many peculiar chapters, but this one is the absolute champion of absurdity. If there were an Oscar for acting in obstetrics, it would go to Mary Toft. Year 1726, England. The Age of Enlightenment. Newton. Science. Reason. And in the midst of all this, a poor, illiterate peasant woman from Surrey asserts, "I give birth to rabbits." Don't laugh. She didn't just say this to her neighbors over a pint of ale. She called a doctor. Local surgeon John Howard rushed to her home and was taken aback. He actually delivered what appeared to be parts of animals: paws, heads, skins, a dead bunny, and then another one, along with a cat. Yes, a cat, not a mistake. Howard was shocked, but being a man of science, or at least what was considered science at that time, he began writing letters. Colleagues, a sensation. Nature had gone mad. Rumors reached London. King George I himself sent his court anatomist, Nathaniel St. Andre, to investigate this marvel. St. Andre arrived and witnessed Mary in labor giving birth to yet another rabbit, and believed it. He didn't just believe it, he penned a treatise, a serious scientific paper, where he thoughtfully explained how this was possible, suggesting it was the power of maternal imagination. Mary, during her pregnancy, had seen a rabbit in the field, had a strong desire to eat it, got frightened, and thus this was the outcome. At that time, doctors earnestly discussed the theory of maternal impression, so the ground was fertile for such ideas. The whole country went wild. People stopped eating rabbit stew, suddenly thinking it could be a relative. Newspapers were filled with headlines. Mary Toft was brought to London, housed in a luxurious bathhouse, and displayed as a curiosity. The best minds of Britain were palpating her belly and nodding knowingly. Yes, something was indeed jumping inside her, but the farce couldn't last forever. One skeptic, a doctor named Richard Manningham, suspected foul play. He noticed a small yet significant detail. The stomachs of the birthed rabbits contained hay and grain. Moreover, the droppings were suspiciously fresh. How could a bunny eat hay while being in a woman's womb? Manningham threatened Mary with a painful operation to study her insides in the name of science. Mary, not foolish, feared the scalpel more than the shame, and she confessed. The scheme was amusingly simple and grotesque. Mary simply inserted parts of animals into herself beforehand and then simulated labor pains. Sometimes her husband aided her, having purchased the rabbits at the market. Why? For fame? No, for money. They hoped the king would grant her a pension as a unique phenomenon. The scandal was monumental. The reputations of the doctors who believed this nonsense were ruined. St. Andre, who had written that very treatise, became a laughingstock throughout London and died in poverty. Cartoonists depicted the physicians with rabbit ears for years. Mary Toft spent some time in jail, but she was released. The judges decided that she had already been punished by public ridicule. Besides, the scam was so absurd that it would have been foolish to try her seriously. This story serves as a perpetual reminder for all of us. Even the most intelligent people, professors and royal surgeons, can fall for utter nonsense if it is shocking enough, and if there is a strong desire to believe in miracles, even if the miracle is fluffy and has ears. Story number 5. The person who sold Big Ben. Forget about Victor Lustig and his Eiffel Tower. That story is too well known. But have you heard about Arthur Ferguson? The Scottish actor turned failed con man who transformed his life into the most expensive performance of the 20th century? In the 1920s, in London at Trafalgar Square, Ferguson strolls, pondering how he might scrounge up money for lunch. Suddenly, he spots an American tourist, wealthy, naive, dressed in an expensive suit, gazing in awe at Nelson's column, and a light bulb goes off in Arthur's mind. He approaches the American, introduces himself as a government agent, and, with a sorrowful yet earnest expression, shares some insider information. "Sir, Britain is bankrupt from the war. We have enormous debts. The government is quietly selling off national monuments to avoid causing panic among the people." The American's jaw drops. "And you know," Ferguson continues, lowering his voice, "we are looking for a worthy buyer for this column, someone who will appreciate its history." Within an hour, a deal was struck. Ferguson walked away with a check for £6,000, an astonishing sum for those times for Nelson's column. This success propelled Arthur further into his schemes. He didn't stop with just that. Over the next few weeks, he sold Big Ben to another tourist, pocketing £1,000 as a deposit. To a couple from Arkansas, he offloaded Buckingham Palace for a mere £2,000, convincing them that the royal family was moving to more modest accommodations. He was a mastermind of psychology, playing on two key aspects: the desire of the wealthy to bring home a piece of old England, and their absolute belief that money could buy anything. When the heat became too intense in London, Ferguson headed to the USA. The logic was simple. If Americans were so easily buying England, what might they purchase back home? And he was right. In Washington, he rented out the White House to a wealthy rancher, assuring him that the government was cutting costs and relocating to an office building. He even came close to selling the Statue of Liberty to an Australian, but that buyer became a bit too suspicious and requested a photo with the seller in front of the monument. That picture marked the end of the illustrious career of the great swindler Ferguson. He was caught and served 5 years in prison. Yet the most amusing part of this tale isn't the audacity of the con man, but the fact that his victims hesitated for months to report him to the police. Imagine having to walk into Scotland Yard and say, "Excuse me, I bought Big Ben and they aren't giving me the keys." Ferguson died in poverty in 1938, but his legacy lives on. Every time you see a tourist who believes in an exclusive offer just for them, somewhere in the heavens a Scottish man grins slyly, having almost sold time once. Now for the sixth story: an army that charged on bicycles and stole a country. When we think of World War II in the Pacific, we envision aircraft carriers, jungles, marines, and brutal battles for every inch of land. However, there was one operation that resembled a scene from an absurdist comedy, if it hadn't been so brilliant and consequential. In 1941, Malaysia, the British fortress, Gibraltar of the East. Singapore seemed impregnable. The British were convinced that the jungles to the north were impassable for tanks and large armies. They anticipated an attack from the sea, positioning all their artillery towards the ocean. Japanese General Tamayuki Yamashita was aware of this situation, yet he faced a significant challenge. He had only 1/3 as many soldiers as the British forces. His fuel supplies for the tanks were dwindling. There was no chance for a direct assault. Then, he made a decision that would be recorded in tactical manuals as a blend of madness and bravery. He had his army ride bicycles. Yes, ordinary, inexpensive bicycles. Thousands of Japanese soldiers pedaled along narrow paths in the jungles where tanks would become stuck and trucks could not maneuver. But that was not the most peculiar aspect. The Japanese understood that tires would burst in the heat and rubber supplies were limited. What could they do? They simply rode on bare metal rims. Imagine that sound. Thousands of bicycles clanging metal against asphalt and stones. The noise was unimaginable. This is where psychology came into play. The British defenders, huddled in their trenches, heard the growing, clattering cacophony, reminiscent of tank treads. "Tanks!" they screamed in panic. They had hundreds of tanks. They were breaking through the jungles. The British were demoralized, thinking that an armored armada was advancing towards them, while in reality, it was just sweaty, weary infantry on bicycles without tires. Yamashita held on until the very end. By the time he reached Singapore, his ammunition was nearly depleted. If the British had launched a counterattack, they would have crushed the Japanese in a matter of hours. However, British General Percival, frightened by the speed and the tank-like noise of the enemy, concluded that resistance was futile and surrendered. 130,000 British, Indian, and Australian soldiers laid down their arms before 30,000 Japanese on bicycles. Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster and the largest surrender in British history, the bicycle blitzkrieg. It sounds amusing until you grasp the scale of the tragedy. Sometimes it's not the one with more artillery who wins, but rather the one who figured out to remove the rubber from the wheels to intimidate the enemy with noise. Story number 7. A man who literally ate the heart of a king. We often use metaphors. He absorbed knowledge, she swallowed her resentment. But William Buckland, an eccentric British geologist and paleontologist of the 19th century, took the verb to eat far too literally, alarmingly literally. Buckland was not just the scientist who first described a dinosaur. In fact, he coined the term megalosaurus. He was obsessed with the idea of tasting everything, absolutely everything that was alive on planet Earth. His home in Oxford resembled a zoo mixed with a mad chef's kitchen. Guests invited to dinner never knew what would be on their plates. "What is this, Buckland?" a guest would inquire, poking at a strange tough meat with a fork. "That's panther," the host would respond, unfazed. "Not very chewy, is it?" Last time, he recalled, the crocodile was more tender. His menu included mice, which he enjoyed battered. There were ostriches, kangaroos, guinea pigs, and even bats. He maintained a tasting diary where he meticulously described the flavors. The worst dish he ever had, he declared, was mole. A disgusting, earthy taste, he noted. We readily believe in the absurdity, but the pinnacle of his culinary madness was the incident at the aristocratic estate of Lord Harcourt. In the year 1848, Buckland was invited to view a family heirloom. Lord Harcourt proudly presented a large silver box. "Here," the Lord whispered with reverence, "is the mummified heart of King Louis I of France, the very Sun King." The heart was small, shriveled, and as black as coal, a great relic saved from the revolutionaries. Buckland took it in his hands, examined it, sniffed it, and before anyone could blink, he proclaimed, "I have eaten many bizarre things, but I have never tasted a king's heart," and popped it into his mouth. The silence in the room must have been deafening. Lord Harcourt turned pale. The guests were frozen, while the esteemed scientist William Buckland simply chewed and swallowed a piece of the monarch who had ruled France for 72 years. "Crunchy," he summarized. So ended the tale of Louis I's heart, not in the fire of revolution, nor in the dust of ages, but in the belly of a British scholar who simply couldn't resist a new taste experience. Buckland passed away a few years later, but the legend of him endures. And frankly, it's a great lesson. Never show your relics to people who eat moles for breakfast. Story number 8. The prison from which everyone escaped. A prison break is always a drama. Tunneling, cut bars, descending on sheets under the cover of night, barking dogs, beams of searchlights. Hollywood has conditioned us to believe that freedom requires incredible effort. But the story of the prison in Peterborough, Ontario, proves otherwise. Sometimes, freedom merely requires a gentle nudge of the shoulder. The year is 1888, autumn. The Peterborough Jail is a solid stone building, the pride of the local sheriff. The walls are thick, the bars sturdy. Inside are various inmates from petty thieves to drunken ruffians. One morning, the warden arrives for work, pours himself some coffee, begins his rounds, and drops his mug. The cells are empty, every single one. The corridors are deserted, the yard vacant. The prison stands utterly abandoned, like a haunted house. Everyone has vanished. Prisoners, detainees, even those who had just a few days left to serve. Panic, anxiety, pursuit. No, first there was bewilderment. How did they manage that? Mass hypnosis? Teleportation? The solution turned out to be ridiculously simple and shameful. The night before, the warden's wife hosted a small party. Music, pies, dancing. The guards apparently thought that guarding empty corridors was dull, so they joined the fun. And when the festivities ended, the last departing staff member simply forgot to lock the main door. Not the door leading to the cells, but the massive external door of the prison. However, that's not all. The cell doors were also unlocked. Why? Because in the 19th century in small towns, the regime was, shall we say, familial. Occasionally, inmates were allowed to step into the corridor to stretch their legs or fetch some water. So picture it. Night. Silence. One of the detainees pushes the cell door. It's open. He steps into the corridor. No one is there. He heads for the exit. He pushes the main door. It creaks as it gives way. The fresh night air, stars, freedom. He goes back to get the others. Hey guys, they forgot to lock us up and just left. They simply took their belongings and left peacefully without any fuss, like checking out of a hotel. The funniest part came after. Some of the escapees didn't even need to be caught. They returned by themselves a few days later. Sorry, boss, one of them said, knocking on that same door. I just went home to see my wife and have a decent meal. Can I finish out my sentence here? Of course, others vanished forever. The sheriff became a laughingstock across Canada. Newspapers reported, the Peterborough jail operates on an all-inclusive basis, including an exit. Since then, perhaps a new rule has appeared in the prison guidelines, boldly highlighted. When leaving, check if the door is locked, even if you're eager to sleep. Story number 9. The ship that sank while saving coal. In maritime tradition, there's a principle about the captain's honor. The captain is the last to leave the vessel. The captain is responsible for the lives on board. The captain is a rock. But in 1909, the captain of a steamboat and the crew of another vessel rewrote the code of honor by adding a chapter titled Absurd Greed. Picture it, a night shrouded in thick fog off the coast of Nantucket, the luxurious liner Republic of the White Star Line, yes, the very same company that would construct the Titanic 3 years later, collides with the Italian liner Florida. The impact was severe. The Republic sustained damage in the engine room and began to slowly sink. But this isn't a tale of tragedy. It's about the world's first rescue operation coordinated via radio. Marconi had just invented the wireless telegraph, and the Republic's operator, Jack Binns, became a hero by sending out a distress signal, CQD, a precursor to SOS. The liner Baltic arrived to help. It took on passengers from both damaged ships. The death toll was remarkably low. Only 6 people perished in the collision. Rescued. A happy ending? Not quite. The Republic didn't want to sink quickly. It stubbornly stayed afloat. And then Captain Silby decided the ship could be saved, and so could the cargo. The cargo was, to put it mildly, intriguing. Rumor had it that it was transporting gold worth a significant fortune, the American fleet's payroll, but officially it was just coal and supplies. Captain Silby remained aboard the sinking vessel with a small team of volunteers. They waited for tugs. Yet the most bizarre behavior came from the crew of the Florida, who also managed to stay afloat, albeit with a battered bow. Once the passengers were transferred to the Baltic, the captain of the Florida suddenly remembered the coal. The Republic was sinking. The Florida was barely hanging on. Yet the sailors began transferring coal from one ship to the other. Imagine that surreal scene. In the fog, amid the ocean, 2 battered giants clung to each other. One was slowly slipping beneath the waves, and instead of praying or seeking safety, people were hauling bags of coal. Why let it go to waste, they must have thought. At the bottom, it's of no use to anyone, and we still have quite a way to sail to the port. Greed or frugality triumphed over the instinct for self-preservation. They were loading coal for several hours until the Republic began to tilt alarmingly. Ultimately, the Republic sank. Captain Silby and his crew jumped into the water at the very last moment and were rescued. The gold, if it existed, has sunk to the bottom, where it remains to this day, driving treasure hunters mad. Meanwhile, part of the coal, the very reason for risking their lives on the sinking ship, safely made it to New York in the hold of the Florida. Apparently, for sailors in the early 20th century, fuel was more important than the fear of death, the irony of fate. The Republic became the largest ship to have ever sunk at that time, but it went down in history not as a tragedy, but as the first triumph of radio and a monument to human pettiness in the face of the abyss. Story number 10. A criminal who forged a career in show business. Picture a film set, sunny California, an amusement park in Long Beach, 1976. Television crews are filming an episode of the popular series The $6 Million Man. A lighting technician moves an old, dusty mannequin of a hanged man, painted in some toxic shade of orange, in the corner. The props appear worn out. A worker tugs on its arm a bit too forcefully, and the arm falls off. The worker curses, bends down to pick up the limb, and freezes in horror as a real human bone protrudes from the plastic arm. The police are called to the set, followed by the coroner. They opened the dummy and confirmed the unbelievable. It's not a mannequin, it's a mummy. A real, dried-up body that had been hanging in a funhouse for years, scaring children. And no one, not even the park owners, knew that it was a corpse. Who was it? His name was Elmer McCurdy, and his life was pathetic. However, his posthumous biography reads like a Hollywood blockbuster. In the early 20th century, Elmer was arguably the most unsuccessful bandit in the Wild West. He attempted to rob trains, but mixed up the dates and attacked the wrong train, obtaining merely $46 and 2 bottles of whiskey instead of the expected safe filled with thousands. He tried to blow open safes with nitroglycerin, but overdosed on it, melting silver coins into a formless lump that couldn't be pried off the wall. In 1911, he was finally shot dead by sheriffs in a shootout. And this is where the real story began. At the undertaker's in Oklahoma, where the body was brought, there were no relatives to pay for the funeral. But the undertaker was a resourceful man. He embalmed Elmer with a generous dose of arsenic, dressed him in a suit, handed him a rifle, and placed him in the window of his funeral parlor. A sign read, "The Bandit Who Would Not Surrender." It cost 5 cents to see him. People paid. Elmer became a local attraction. The undertaker was making a great profit, until one day, 2 brothers of the deceased came demanding the body for a proper burial, with tears in their eyes. The undertaker complied. However, these weren't brothers but the owners of a traveling circus. From that moment on, the insane odyssey of the dead Elmer began. For 60 years he toured America, displayed in dime museums, wax figure exhibitions, and cheap sideshows. He was referred to as both an ancient criminal and a person who had turned to stone. Over the years, his skin darkened, his ears shriveled, and his clothing was changed numerous times. Owners came and went, and the tale of him being a real person faded into obscurity. He became merely an old prop. He was tossed in storage, coated with varnish, hung by a noose for intimidation in a haunted house. Thousands passed by, laughed, and pointed, unaware that they were gazing at the face of a corpse that had perished long before the First World War. It was only in '76, when his arm was accidentally severed, that Elmer found peace. His identity was confirmed through old police photographs and a bullet lodged in his chest. He was buried in Oklahoma at the Boot Hill Cemetery, but this time, to ensure Elmer wouldn't go on tour again, 2 cubic meters of concrete were poured over his coffin. It appears this is the only instance in history where a person gained significantly more money and fame after death than during their life. The irony of fate. The unsuccessful robber made it onto television, albeit as a prop with a severed arm. Case number 11. A man tried for murdering himself. We are accustomed to seeing an accused and a victim in court, and they are typically 2 distinct individuals. However, in 1812, a legal oddity occurred in the English town of Hammersmith that would have caused modern lawyers to twitch. Meet Thomas Millwood, an ordinary bricklayer, a nice guy who loved his wife, his job, and white clothing. This was his fateful mistake, the clothing. In those days, Hammersmith was gripped by hysteria. A ghost was spotted at night in the cemetery. People swore that a tall white figure sprang up from behind gravestones, moaned, and terrified passers-by to the brink of death. A pregnant woman even died from shock after encountering the spirit. The neighborhood was in a panic. Men formed patrols with guns to catch the ghost. Among the hunters was a certain Francis Smith, a young, hot-headed fellow armed with a pistol. On the evening of January 3rd, Thomas Millwood was returning from work. He was dressed in his work uniform, white trousers, a white flannel jacket, and a white apron. Covered in lime dust, in the darkness and fog, he glowed like a ghost. Francis Smith spotted a white figure in the alley. "Halt! Who goes there?" he shouted. Millwood, weary from his shift, either did not respond or simply did not have time. Smith, shaking with fear and adrenaline, fired. Millwood fell. The ghost turned out to be a dead bricklayer. In court, the facts were clear. Smith had killed a man, but the defense presented an argument that perplexed the judges. Smith did not intend to kill Millwood. He shot at a ghost, and a ghost cannot be killed because it is already dead. Hence, Smith lacked the intent to murder a human being. It sounds logical, perfectly so for the 19th century. But then, the mother-in-law of the deceased took the stand. She testified under oath that just days before the tragedy, she begged her son-in-law to change his clothes. "Thomas," she said, "they all think you're a ghost. Wear a cloak." Thomas merely brushed her off, and thus the court found itself at an impasse. It turned out that Millwood knew that his white clothing was dangerous, understood that there was a panic in the town, but still went into the darkness dressed like the main local fright. Lawyers began to seriously deliberate whether this constituted a form of suicide or at least a criminal carelessness on the part of the victim. It appeared that Mill, by his mere appearance, had instigated his own demise. Smith was initially sentenced to hanging. The judge was quite harsh. Whether or not you believe in ghosts, shooting people on the street is unacceptable. Yet public opinion erupted in outrage. People felt sympathy for the ghost hunter. The king intervened and commuted the death penalty to 1 year in prison. Bricklayer Thomas Millwood then entered legal history as a man whose fault was merely his excessive fondness for white and his aversion to listening to his mother-in-law. By the way, the actual ghost, a prankster in a bedsheet who frightened people for fun, was discovered a couple of days later. It turned out to be a cobbler who simply wanted to get back at his apprentices. Story number 12. The corpse that won an election. They say politics is a dirty business. However, in mid-20th century America, specifically in Missouri, it became something even more posthumous. In 2000, yes, this tale is relatively recent, but it has already become a classic in the archives of oddities. Elections were underway for the Senate. The main candidate from the Democrats was Mel Carnahan, a seasoned politician, governor, and a beloved figure. His opponent was the Republican John Ashcroft. The competition was fierce and intense, with debates, rallies, and posters. But 3 weeks before the voting day, tragedy struck. A small plane carrying Mel Carnahan crashed in a forest. All aboard perished, the candidate himself, his son the pilot, and an aide. The state was in shock, mourning, candles, tears. However, there was a bureaucratic dilemma. The ballots had already been printed, millions of them. The laws of Missouri are stringent. Changing candidate lists with such short notice is not allowed. Striking a name off is also prohibited. Mel Carnahan's name remained on the ballot. The situation was absurd. Voters would arrive at the polls to find the name of someone who had already been buried. What was to be done? The Republicans scoffed publicly, but in their headquarters they rubbed their hands in glee. But really, who would be inclined to vote for a deceased individual? Ashcroft's victory seemed inevitable. He even suspended his campaign out of respect for the deceased. But the Democrats made a clever move. The widow of the late Mel, Jean Carnahan, addressed the public, stating, "If you choose my husband, I will take his place in the Senate and serve as his voice." Here, an unusual psychology kicked in. On one side, there was sympathy. On the other, the principle of voting for someone, anyone, as long as it wasn't a Republican. And finally, Americans simply liked the idea of casting their vote for a ghost. On Election Day, November 7th, people headed to the polls and Mel Carnahan emerged victorious. The deceased candidate, lying in his grave, defeated the living, healthy, and very ambitious John Ashcroft by a margin of over 40,000 votes. This marked the first instance in U.S. Senate history where an election was won by a deceased individual. John Ashcroft entered history as the man who lost a debate to a corpse. It is said that he accepted his defeat with dignity, remarking something along the lines of, "I hope the voters know what they are doing." Legally, the victory was formalized as follows. Since the winner could not, for obvious reasons, take the oath, the governor of the state appointed his widow to fill the vacated position. Jean Carnahan served in the Senate for 2 years, demonstrating that behind every great man stands a woman, even if that man has already departed this life. Story number 13. The man who purchased his own freedom. 3 times. Slavery stands as one of the darkest chapters in history. Typically, we hear about slaves who escaped, revolted, or perished. However, the tale of Moses Grandy is that of a man who chose to play by the rules of the system in order to conquer it from within. Time and time again, the system deceived him, yet he remained more determined. The early 19th century, the American South. Moses Grandy was born into slavery, but he was more than just a slave. He was a skilled captain of a riverboat. His owners valued his talents because he generated significant profits by managing barges. Moses harbored a dream of buying his freedom. In those days, it was theoretically possible. A slave could work overtime, save up money, and if the owner agreed, pay for their freedom. Moses worked tirelessly. He transported cargo, engaged in petty trading, and penny-pinched for years. Finally, he amassed the required amount. He approached his owner and poured the coins onto the table. The owner smiled, took the money, and sold Moses to another master. Imagine that despair. Your years of labor, your hope, everything taken away in an instant. Anyone else would have crumbled, turned to drink, or jumped off a bridge. But Moses Grandy was made of sturdier stuff. He gritted his teeth and began again. With the new owner, he negotiated for his freedom once more, worked through the nights again, and saved. Years passed again. The amount was gathered. He handed over the money. And what do you think happened? Correct. The owner pocketed the money and resold him to a third master. This sounds like some sadistic anecdote, like the curse of Sisyphus. A man bought his freedom twice, yet remained a piece of property. But the third owner, Mr. Stewart, did he have a conscience? Not exactly. Moses simply became wiser. He realized that a white gentleman's word in the South meant nothing when it came to a slave. For the third time, he amassed money with a fanatical determination, but this time he didn't just hand it over to the owner. He found a white man he could trust. Yes, they did exist, and he asked him to act as a mediator. When he gathered the total for the third time, think about it, 3 complete values of a person, the deal was sealed. In 1833, Moses Grandy received the coveted document. He became a free man. But that was not the end. Do you think he moved north and lived peacefully? No, he had a wife and children, still enslaved. And Moses went back to working on the river, now as a free man, earning his full wages. He worked for many more years, buying his family one by one, his wife, his children, his grandchildren. He spent his entire life and a fortune on this endeavor. Moses Grandy died a free old man, penning memoirs that read like a thriller. A man who proved that freedom is not a gift, but a commodity. And if you've been cheated at the register, you don't walk away, you line up again. Story number 14. The skyscraper that settled while being washed. They say the devil is in the details, and in Texas, in 1919, it turned out that the devil resides in punctuation. Let's take a trip to the city of Wichita Falls. Picture the atmosphere. The oil boom is in full swing. Black gold erupts from the ground in fountains. The town is flooded with individuals who were farmers yesterday and are millionaires today. Everyone is in a rush, all eager to get their slice of the pie. There's a shortage of office space. Deals are being made right on the streets, in the dust, on the hoods of cars. And then he appears. J.D. McMahon, an engineer, entrepreneur, a man with honest eyes and a fat folder of blueprints. He gathers wealthy investors and proclaims, "Gentlemen, our city needs a symbol, a skyscraper, a magnificent building that will be seen for miles." He unfurls the blueprints. The investors gaze at the stunning structure reaching upwards. They notice the number 480. 480, the oilmen whisper in admiration. That's the height in feet. We will show Dallas what we can do. The funds are raised instantly. $200,000, a staggering sum for that time. McMahon hired a crew, and construction began to buzz with activity. Investors strolled by, proudly glancing at the construction fence. However, questions soon arose. The building was growing, but oddly, it was narrow. Too narrow. It didn't rise skyward as expected, but seemed stuck in development. When the workers placed the last brick, the skyscraper stood at a mere 12 meters, 4 stories tall. It was a red brick tower that barely accommodated a writing desk. The stairs were so steep that climbing them felt like ascending Everest. The investors were furious. "Where is our skyscraper?" they shouted, dragging McMahon to court. "You promised us 480 feet." The judge examined the blueprints closely, then glanced at the red-faced investors, delivering a verdict that likely had the courtroom erupting with laughter or despair. "Gentlemen," stated the judge, "Mr. McMahon built precisely what was drawn. Look closely." The blueprints next to the number 480 feature not one dash indicating feet, but two dashes indicating inches. 480 inches equals 12 meters. Blinded by greed and haste, the investors failed to check the scale. They signed a contract for a 4-story extension, believing they were purchasing the Empire State Building. McMahon was acquitted. He had fulfilled the contract honestly. However, he didn't dare stay in town and fled before the disgruntled investors could retaliate. The building remains to this day. It is referred to as the world's smallest skyscraper. Initially, the locals wanted to tear it down, but eventually, they grew fond of it as a monument to human inattention and greed. Ultimately, it might be the only structure in the world built not from bricks and concrete, but from a mere typographical error in the mind of the client. Story number 15. The war that an entire fleet slept through. The tale is filled with great naval battles: Trafalgar, Jutland, Midway, the sound of cannons, smoke, heroism. Yet there is one battle that military historians speak of in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact in shame and suppressing nervous laughter. The year is 1998. During the Spanish-American War, the American cruiser Charleston receives a secret order to capture the island of Guam. This was a Spanish colony, a critical strategic point in the Pacific Ocean. Captain Henry Glass prepares his crew for a serious fight. The Spaniards will fight to the last, he thinks. On June 20th, the Charleston approaches the island. An old Spanish ship is anchored in the bay. On the shore, Fort Santa Cruz is visible. Captain Glaze commands, "Fire!" The American cannons roar. Boom, boom. The projectiles whistle over the water, but fail to hit anything. The captain ordered the shots to be fired overhead to showcase power and offer a chance to surrender. The smoke dissipates. Silence falls. There's not a single shot fired from the Spanish side. No panic. No soldiers running about. The fort remains quiet. The ship in the bay gently rocks on the waves. "They are preparing a trap," Captain Glaze grows grim. "Or are their cannons so far-reaching that they allow us to approach closer?" The Americans wait, nerves on edge. An hour passes, and then a small boat pushes off from the shore. Several Spanish officers in their dress uniforms row towards the American cruiser. Diplomats, decide the Americans. The Spaniards board the Charleston, smiling and bowing. The leader among them, Captain Porta, speaks in broken English. "Good day, gentlemen. Welcome to Guam." The American captain looks at them as if they are fools. "Are you surrendering?" he asks. The Spaniard blinks in surprise. "Pardon us, we wanted to thank you for the salute. It was very kind of you to greet us with cannon fire. Unfortunately, we have no gunpowder in the fort to respond with the same salute." A pause ensues. A long, awkward pause, where the gears turn in both parties' minds. It turns out the Spanish garrison on Guam simply did not know that war was underway. They had no telegraph. The last mail had arrived 2 months prior. They lived in blissful ignorance, believing that the USA and Spain were the best of friends. When the Americans began firing real shells, the Spaniards thought it was friendly visits and military honors. Captain Glaze, suppressing either laughter or pity, delivered the news to them. "Gentlemen, you are my prisoners. We have been at war for 6 months." The faces of the Spaniards fell. The island's governor was furious, not at the enemies, but at his postal service. The next day, the entire garrison, 54 men, surrendered without a single shot fired. This became the only battle in history that concluded with an apology for the defeated's lack of gunpowder to return the salute. Guam became American, and history has shown that sometimes ignorance is not strength, but rather the best way to lose a war before it even begins. Story number 16. the lawyer who proved innocence by dying for it. In court, one frequently hears, "I am willing to give my life to prove my client's right." A beautiful phrase, lofty. Usually, after this, the lawyer simply adjusts his tie and sits back down. However, Clement Vallandigham, a notable American politician and lawyer of the 19th century, was a man of his word. Too literal, in fact. In the year 1871, in the state of Ohio, a sensational murder trial unfolds. A man named Tom Myers is shot down in a bar. The prosecution claims it was committed by Thomas McGahan, the client of our hero. All evidence is stacked against him: motive, witnesses, a quarrel. It seemed guaranteed that a conviction was certain, but Vallandigham builds his defense on a bold theory. "My client didn't fire the shot," he states. "Myers shot himself. Accidentally." The judge raises an eyebrow skeptically. How can someone accidentally shoot themselves in a bar during a fight? Vallandigham explains, "Myers was pulling a gun out of his pocket. The trigger snagged on his clothing, and bam! An unfortunate incident." It sounds unconvincing, and the jurors yawn. Vallandigham realizes he needs tangible evidence. He needs an experiment. The evening before the final session, he rehearses his speech in his hotel room. He invites fellow lawyers, wanting to demonstrate exactly how it happened. Vallandigham picks up a firearm. He believes it to be unloaded. This is a crucial detail. "Look," he says, pacing around the room. "This is how Myers reached into his pocket. Like this, he pulled the gun out. He pushes the barrel into his trouser pocket, tugs it upwards, simulating the trigger snag. The muzzle is pointed at his stomach. Click. The shot erupts in the small room like the blast of a cannon. The gun was loaded. The bullet pierced the lawyer's abdomen. Vallandigham collapsed onto the carpet, bleeding profusely. His colleagues rushed to his aid in horror. "Oh my God, Clement!" they cried. The doctors arrived quickly, but the wound was fatal. Vallandigham suffered agonizingly throughout the night. However, the irony that sends chills down the spine is that his death became the perfect, irrefutable evidence for his theory. The next day, the court resumed. The news of the lawyer's demise shocked everyone, but the argument was solid. If an experienced lawyer who understood firearms could accidentally shoot himself demonstrating a trick, then a drunken guy in a bar could do the same. The jury acquitted Thomas McGahan. He was released from the courtroom. Clement Vallandigham won his final case. The cost of victory was his own life. He perhaps became the only lawyer in history who defended a client not through eloquence, but through his own death. Interestingly, some whispered later, "I wonder if he took his fee in advance." Story number 17. The Man Who Invented Civilization. Imagine a dinner in Europe during the Middle Ages. A castle, torches smoking, a mountain of meat on the table. Lords and ladies in heavy garments, smelling of sweat and smoke, grab greasy chunks with their hands, gnaw on bones, and toss them onto the floor where dogs scavenge. They drink wine from rough metallic tankards. All the dishes are dumped onto the table at once. Fish next to game, pies mixed with porridge. This was the norm. This was culture. Now let's move south to Córdoba, in the shining caliphate of Al-Andalus. Here, escaping from envy, came a man from Baghdad named Abul Hassan Ali ibn Nafi. Too complex, let's simplify. They called him Ziryab, the Black Nightingale. Ziryab was a musician, a poet, a genius. But frankly, his greatest talent lay elsewhere. He knew how to live beautifully. He was horrified by how Europeans lived. When he arrived in Córdoba, he didn't start penning complaints in a suggestion book. He simply began changing the world around him, quietly but steadily. Think that's an exaggeration? Well, before Ziryab, people didn't know what a three-course meal was. They just ate everything together. Ziryab said, "Wait a minute, this is barbarism. First soup, then the main course, which could be meat or fish, and only after that, dessert, fruits, and nuts. A revolution." Before Ziryab, people drank from golden and silver cups. Ziryab winced. Metal spoils the flavor of wine, and, in general, it is uncouth. He envisioned crystal goblets for the court, light, transparent, and ringing like bells. Shock. Before Ziryab, people dined off tablecloths that were washed only once a year. Ziryab brought the idea of leather napkins from Persia, which could be wiped clean, but he didn't stop at just food. Why do you wear the same clothes in winter and summer, he wondered, and introduced the trend of seasonal clothing. Light, bright silks for summer, dense, dark fabrics and furs for winter. He even set precise dates for when the court should change their attire. He opened the first barbershop in Europe and popularized short hairstyles and bangs. Yes, the very bangs that are now known as the bank. Prior to him, aristocrats roamed around looking unkempt and bearded. And finally, the most significant contribution, for which we all owe him a monument. Ziryab brought with him the recipe for the world's first toothpaste. He blended various herbs and minerals to create a formula that not only cleaned teeth, but also left a pleasant scent. Before him, the best oral hygiene product in Europe was charcoal, or, forgive me, urine. This man, a fugitive from Baghdad, single-handedly taught medieval Europe to eat in an orderly fashion, drink from glass, get haircuts, switch clothing with the seasons, and maintain dental hygiene. He even introduced them to asparagus, which had been regarded as a weed before his time. We do not know what Ziryab looked like. No portraits of him have survived. But every time you sit at a table, pick up a fork, drink from a goblet, or squeeze toothpaste onto your brush, somewhere deep in the corridors of time, a black dervish smiles at you. A man who proved that history is not only about warriors and kings. Sometimes it's simply about good food and fresh breath. Story number 18. The city drowned in wine. Imagine a flood. Murky torrents of water, mud, panic, rescue boats. A dreadful scene, isn't it? Now replace the water with red wine. 1,000 liters of top-quality Portuguese wine. The year? Lisbon in the Baixa district. This was not just a city, it was a hub of global trade. Ships brought gold from Brazil and spices from India. But the true treasure of Portugal was wine, port wine. It was stored in vast cellars in gigantic oak barrels. On one hot summer day, something went awry in the cellars of an old winery. Either a barrel cracked from the heat, or a worker stumbled and knocked a tap. No one knows for sure, but one barrel started leaking. A chain reaction ensued. A deluge of wine surged, undermining the supports of neighboring barrels. One after another, like dominoes, the enormous casks began to topple and break. The cellar turned into a swirling lake, but the wine did not stop. It burst through doors and flooded into the streets. This was not a flood, it was a wine deluge. Rivers of red wine flowed through narrow, cobbled streets. First, delicate streams, then torrents up to ankle deep, and then rising to the knees. The air was thick with an intoxicating aroma. The reaction of the residents was mixed. Certainly, the merchants whose shops were inundated with the sticky red liquid were horrified. The goods were spoiled, leading to losses, but the rest of the city saw this as a heavenly gift. People rushed out of their homes with buckets, pots, jugs, hats, and anything they could find. They scooped up free wine straight from the streets. Some simply laid on the ground and drank from puddles. Drunken sailors belted out songs while standing waist-deep in the port. It was said that even priests took chalices from the church to gather some divine grace. By evening, the entire Baihu district was dead drunk. It was probably the most joyous apocalypse in history. Nobody died, except for the reputation of the vintners. No one was seriously harmed, apart from those who suffered hangovers in the morning. The city authorities, of course, were not pleased. They had to spend several days cleaning the sticky streets of wine and reviving the populace. However, the tale became part of local folklore. To this day, people in Lisbon joke that in the year 76, even the horses drank sangria instead of water from the fountains. The moral? Sometimes a disaster is just an excuse for a good party, especially when it smells of grapes and oak barrels. Story number 19. The man who set Europe ablaze simply by crossing out a few words. Have you ever witnessed how a single word can change everything? How an awkward phrase on a date can ruin an evening, or how a typo in a contract can cost millions? Now imagine that a few crossed-out words cost hundreds of thousands of lives and redrew the map of an entire continent. The year was 1870, Berlin. It was an ordinary dinner during a hot July evening. The three most powerful men in Prussia sat in the room: Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and his generals, Moltke and von Roon. The mood was dismal. Bismarck was in a state of despair. His grand plan to unite the fragmented German territories into a single empire was falling apart. France, led by Napoleon II, was vehemently opposed. "It's all over," Bismarck said grimly, pushing away his plate. "I'm resigning." The generals nodded. They were also ready to relinquish their positions. The dream of a great Germany was dying right there at the table, under the haze of cigars and fine wine. Then, just as dessert was served and the conversation had soured, a servant entered the room with a silver tray, upon which lay a single piece of paper, a telegram from the spa town of Ems. It had been sent by King Wilhelm I of Prussia. The telegram dryly reported on his meeting with the French ambassador. The ambassador demanded that Prussia renounce any claims to the Spanish throne forever. The king politely yet firmly declined. That was the end of the conversation. Everything was peaceful, diplomatic, boring. Bismarck read the telegram aloud. The generals sank further into despair. "And that's it?" Moltke groaned. "The king has shown weakness. We are humiliated." That's when something sparked in Bismarck's eyes. He picked up a pencil. "Hold on," he said. The king had permitted the contents of this message not to be published. He placed the telegram on the table. Do you think he lied? Added an insult? No, he did something far more brilliant and wicked. He began to strike through the text. He crossed out all the polite phrases, all the words about a courteous discussion, every mention that the matter was resolved. He left only the bare, prickly essence. The original text went something like this: His Majesty the King kindly informed the ambassador that he could not make such promises, and with that, the audience was concluded. Bismarck's edited version sounded like this: His Majesty the King refused to receive the French ambassador and commanded that he be informed he has nothing further to say. Can you sense the difference? The first version is a polite refusal. The second is a slap in the face. It's a door slammed right in France's face. Bismarck read the new version aloud. The grim generals transformed, and their eyes lit up. "Goodness!" exclaimed Moltke. Previously, it sounded like a signal to retreat. Now, it felt like a red rag to a Gallic bull. The telegram was immediately dispatched to all the newspapers in Europe. The impact was akin to a bomb exploding. In Paris, crowds surged into the streets shouting, "To Berlin!" France felt mortally insulted. In Berlin, crowds also filled the streets, but they were yelling, "To Paris!" Germany felt equally offended. Within 6 days, France declared war on Prussia. That was the very war Bismarck needed. A war in which France was defeated and the fragmented German states, uniting against a common foe, coalesced into a powerful German empire. Just a few crossed-out words, drops of falsehood, only pure, concentrated truth, served from the right angle. History has shown that sometimes the most terrifying weapon is neither a cannon nor a bayonet. It's a red pencil in the hands of someone who knows where to strike. Story number 20. The day Australia vanished. Imagine a morning. You pour yourself a cup of coffee, grab the newspaper, and on the front page, in gigantic letters, it reads, "Australia missing." And this is no joke, no April Fool's prank. This is an actual headline that shocked the residents of a small Swedish town. 1997. The town of Vänersborg, Sweden. A dull, quiet place where the most exciting event is the Thursday market. The town has its own newspaper, just as boring as the town itself. It prints announcements, obituaries, weather forecasts. The editor was a man named Conrad Persson. One fine day, Persson received a telegram from his correspondent in Stockholm. The message was brief. The Swedish Academy of Sciences reports that due to severe tremors in the Pacific Ocean, the continent of Australia has sunk. Millions of people are dead. Any normal editor would have had alarm bells ringing in their heads, checking it out, calling other agencies. This could be the news of the century. But Conrad Persson was not that type. He was a man of action, and possibly not the smartest man on the planet. He halted the press. He completely redesigned the front page. He bolded a giant screaming headline about the destruction of an entire continent. The paper was published and flew off the shelves like hotcakes. Vannersburg descended into chaos. People wept in the streets. Emergency services were called for prayers for the souls of the deceased Australians in churches. A wealthy merchant who had a business partner in Sydney fainted right in his store. Women in black shawls hurried from house to house, spreading dreadful news. The city was engulfed in sorrow. The mourning lasted for several hours. Then newspapers from Stockholm arrived in town. Not a single word about Australia was mentioned. They wrote about the harvest, the king's visits, and some petty theft. Someone called the capital. "Excuse me, what's going on with Australia?" inquired a voice from Vannersburg. "Australia?" came the surprised response on the other end. "What about it?" "It's just sitting there. The kangaroos are hopping around." It turned out this was all a prank. A correspondent from Stockholm had merely wagered with friends that he could publish something totally absurd in the paper. And he did. When the truth was revealed, the grief in Vannersburg turned into fury. An enraged mob with pitchforks and torches, well, maybe without the pitchforks, but definitely furious, set off toward the newspaper office. They wanted to lynch Conrad Persson for drowning their emotions in a fabricated ocean. The editor had to flee the city under the cover of night. He never returned. This tale became a legend. It demonstrates two truths. First, never trust news that sounds too outrageous. Second, if you live in a small, dull town, be cautious. Sometimes a single newspaper hoax can create a tsunami stronger than any earthquake. Story number 21. The man who poisoned the world with the best intentions. Some individuals enter history as villains. Hitler, Genghis Khan, Nero. Their names send chills down spines. Yet there are far worse villains. Those who meant no harm, who sincerely believed they were saving humanity. Meet Thomas Midgley Jr. Had there been a contest for the person who caused the most damage to the earth single-handedly, Midgley would win decisively. And he died believing he was a hero. At the beginning of the 20th century, America was enamored with automobiles, but faced a significant issue. The engines rattled. The irritating metallic knock diminished power and drained drivers' energy. This was called knocking. General Motors hired a brilliant young chemist, Thomas Midgley, to solve this problem, and he found a solution. In 1921, after hundreds of experiments, he discovered a miraculous substance. Just a few drops added to gasoline transformed engines into smooth, quiet, and powerful machines. This was tetraethyl lead. In simpler terms, lead. The world was thrilled. Midgley became a national hero. Leaded gasoline dominated the planet, and then hell broke loose. Workers in the factories producing the additive began to go insane. They experienced hallucinations, jumped from windows, and suffered agonizing deaths. Newspapers reported on the madness factory. What did Midgley do? He held a press conference. Before astonished journalists, he poured a flask of tetraethyl lead over his hands and dramatically inhaled the fumes for a minute. "I could do this every day," he declared. "I'm not at risk." He was lying. After this demonstration, he spent a year recovering from lead poisoning, but the world believed him. For the next 50 years, billions of vehicles released microscopic lead particles into the atmosphere. It settled into the soil, the water, and our lungs. Scientists later proved that lead poisoning irreversibly decreases IQ in children, incites aggression, and causes health issues across entire generations. Midgley single-handedly made humanity a little bit less intelligent and more malicious. Think that's all? Oh no, that's just the beginning. After solving one problem, Midgley tackled another: refrigerators. Back then, They operated using toxic gases such as ammonia and sulfur dioxide. If one of those refrigerators leaked, an entire family could perish in their sleep. Once again, Midgley locked himself in the lab and discovered the perfect solution, a new, entirely safe, non-toxic gas called Freon. He became a hero once more. Refrigerators and air conditioners became safe and widely available. The world expressed its gratitude. Decades passed before we understood the consequences of Freon in the stratosphere. It destroys the ozone layer, our sole shield against harsh ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Unbeknownst to him, Midgley had created a massive hole in the planet's defense. And here comes the end, an irony that darkens the mind. In his old age, Thomas Midgley contracted polio and was confined to bed. Yet he was an inventor to the core. He devised a complex system of ropes and pulleys to lift himself from bed without assistance. In 1944, he was found dead, having become entangled in the ropes of his own invention, ultimately choking himself. The man who invented two of the most destructive substances to the environment in history was killed by his last seemingly harmless creation. Sometimes the road to hell is paved not only with good intentions, but also with lead and the scent of Freon. Story number 22. The day London came to visit. Have you ever wondered what chaos truly is? No, not war or revolution, but pure, senseless chaos, born from boredom and a silly prank. It was the year 1810 in London on Berners Street, number 54, a respectable neighborhood, quiet, cozy, orderly. Here lived the widow Mrs. Tottenham. Her life was as tranquil as the street outside her window. The highlight of her day was the milkman's visit. Across the street sat two gentlemen, Theodore Hook and Samuel Beasley, both known in the city for their wit and humor. They were gazing at Mrs. Tottenham's house. "I bet you a guinea," Hook said, lazily stirring his coffee, "that I can make this house the most famous address in all of London in 24 hours. Beasley smirked. "Impossible. Let's see," he replied. With that, Hook took up his pen and paper. The next morning, on November 27th, there was a knock at Mrs. Tottenham's door. A chimney sweep stood on the doorstep. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I didn't order a chimney sweep," the widow politely stated. Before she could close the door, a coal cart arrived, followed by a furniture van, and then 12 pianos, one after another. Panic ensued for Mrs. Tottenham. She hadn't placed any orders, and from then on, the madness escalated. People began flocking to her home. Not just any people, everyone from the service industry in London. Dozens of doctors arrived because they were informed someone was dying. Dozens of lawyers came because they were told that a will was being drawn up. Pastry chefs with enormous wedding cakes, priests for solemn ceremonies, undertakers with empty coffins. The street is congested, carriages cannot pass, and fights break out among the drivers. But that's not all. Official figures arrive at house number 54. The Mayor of London, the Governor of the Bank of England, the Chairman of the East India Company, even the Archbishop of Canterbury. Each of them has received an urgent letter concerning a matter of state importance. Bernard Street is paralyzed. The entire center of London is caught in a massive traffic jam. The crowd of onlookers grows. Everyone wants to see the house that all the most important people in the kingdom are trying to access simultaneously. The police attempt to restore order, but they are powerless. This is not a riot. It's merely a queue. A very peculiar queue. Meanwhile, Theodore Hook spends the day in that very cafe, having rented a room on the second floor, laughing as he observes the chaos he has orchestrated. He wrote hundreds, if not thousands of letters in the name of Mrs. Tottenham. He ordered everything that could possibly be requested in London to one address and at the same time. By evening, when the chaos reached its peak, Hook quietly slipped out of the cafe and vanished. He didn't have to pay the genius. He won the bet. Mrs. Tottenham became an involuntary celebrity, and London merchants remained suspicious of orders from Berners Street for quite some time. This was arguably the first flash mob in history, the first viral attack, a testament that to turn an entire city upside down, no army or conspiracy is needed, just a bored genius with a pen and ink. Story number 23. an island that declared war on the United States. When we think of America's enemies, powerful empires, terrorist networks, ideological opponents come to mind. However, in 1982, this list unexpectedly included a tiny island in Florida called Key West. Imagine the West: sunshine, beaches, cocktails, a laid-back atmosphere. The locals refer to themselves as conchs, named after the shell. Their motto: one human race, tourism is their bread and butter. But one morning, this paradise came to an end. The American government established a checkpoint on the only road connecting the island to the mainland as part of its fight against drug trafficking and illegal immigration. Every vehicle departing from Key West was stopped, searched, and had its documents checked. For tourists, it was an inconvenience. For the locals, it was a disaster. A traffic jam stretching 27 kilometers formed. Tourists, having waited for several hours, turned around and left. The island's economy began to crumble. The mayor of Key West, Dennis Wardlow, flew to Washington. He begged, pleaded, insisted. "You treat us as if we were a foreign country," he yelled at officials. No one listened. Then, upon returning home, the mayor gathered the city council and uttered a sentence that left all in disbelief. "Since they treat us like a foreign country, let's become one." On April 23, 1982, amid the applause of thousands of residents, Mayor Wardlow stepped onto the square, unfurled a blue and yellow flag with a shell, and solemnly declared Key West's secession from the United States. The Republic of Kong was born. "We declare war on the United States of America," proclaimed the mayor, who had become the prime minister. War began. It lasted about 1 minute. Prime Minister Wardlow symbolically smashed a loaf of stale Cuban bread over the head of a man dressed as a United States Navy officer. In reality, it was his costumed friend. This was the first and last shot fired in this conflict. Immediately after, he announced the capitulation. "We surrender," he declared, demanding foreign aid of $1 billion to restore our war-torn economy. This was a brilliant strategy. The story of a minute-long war against the USA spread like wildfire through global media. Crowds of journalists flooded into Yes, followed by tourists eager to visit the rebellious republic. The U.S. government, witnessing the spectacle and realizing the absurdity of the situation, quietly removed the checkpoint. The Republic of Kong emerged victorious. Formally, it still exists today. Every year on April 23rd, the island celebrates Independence Day. They issue their own souvenir passports, have their own flag, anthem, and even a military comprised of people who throw stale bread. They lost a war in 1 minute, but they won the battle for attention, for tourists, and for the right not to be stuck in traffic. They demonstrated that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to bring it to absurdity. Story number 24. The City That Drowned in Manure. London, late 19th century. Imagine, not the elegant cabs from Sherlock Holmes films, but the stench. An all-pervasive, thick, acrid odor. The smell of horse manure. In that year, London had over 50,000 horses pulling omnibuses, cabs, and carts. Each horse produced around 10 kilograms of manure daily. Multiply 500 tons each day on the streets of one city. This was not just a smell, it was an ecological disaster. In the summer, the manure dried and turned into dust, clogging the lungs. In winter, it mixed with rain and snow, turning the streets into a foul swamp in which galoshes and children's shoes sank. And then, clouds of flies, spreading typhus and cholera. The city authorities were in despair. They hired thousands of crossing boys, whose sole job was to clear the pathways for pedestrians in this sea of excrement. The situation seemed hopeless. In 1894, The Times published a grim forecast. Scientists calculated that if the population growth and number of horses continued at the same rate, by 1950, the streets of London would be buried under 3 meters of manure. This was called the Great Manure Crisis. In 1898, New York, facing a similar problem, hosted the world's first International Congress on Urban Planning. Delegates from various countries gathered to address the main issue of the century: what to do with the manure. They met for 10 days, discussing, debating, and drawing diagrams. Do you know what conclusion they reached? None at all. The problem was deemed unsolvable. The Congress adjourned early because no one could suggest anything other than building taller buildings. It seemed civilization was doomed to drown in the waste products of its primary mode of transportation. The end of the world was supposed to smell like stables. But then, a miracle happened. A miracle that none of those intelligent folks at the Congress foresaw. It was named Henry Ford. The automobile had arrived. Initially, it was an expensive toy meant for the wealthy. But then Ford put it on the assembly line, and in just 10 to 15 years, horses vanished from the streets. They were replaced by noisy, smoky, but far cleaner machines. The problem that the brightest minds on the planet couldn't solve resolved itself. It was addressed by technological advancement, which none of them had contemplated. The Great Horse Crisis ended before it even began. It simply got run over. And this perhaps serves as the best lesson for all the alarmists and doomsday prophets. Sometimes, when it seems the world is spiraling into chaos, somewhere in a garage, an engine is already being assembled that will change everything, and might even liberate us from the scent we believed was eternal. Story number 25. The artist who painted cats to escape madness. Have you ever come across cat drawings that leave you feeling uneasy? Neither sinister nor frightening, just plain strange? As if the artist peeked beyond the boundary of reality and depicted what they saw there. Meet Louis Wain. By the end of the 19th century, he was the most renowned artist in England, at least the most famous artist who specialized in cats. His felines were delightful. They played cricket, sipped tea, and attended the opera. Fluffy, charming, anthropomorphized beings. Wain was a superstar. His postcards flew off the shelves by the millions. Almost every English household had a calendar adorned with his kitties. He was a kind, eccentric, yet utterly normal man. Then, his wife succumbed to cancer, and Louis's world began to crack. His behavior grew increasingly bizarre. He could stand in the middle of the street for hours, waving his arms and mumbling. He claimed that electricity was stealing thoughts from his mind. Ultimately, in 1924, he was declared insane and admitted to a psychiatric asylum. However, he didn't stop painting. He continued to portray cats, and this is where it gets most intriguing. His cats began to evolve. They lost their charming cartoonish form. At first, they simply became more vivid, and their eyes more unsettling. Then, their fur started to morph into intricate fractal patterns, swirls, mandalas, kaleidoscopes. The cats seemed to dissolve into the ornamentation. Their outlines faded away, transforming into pure pulsating energy. They were no longer cats. They had become figures from another dimension, vibrant, psychedelic, almost electric. They resembled what people might perceive under the influence of potent hallucinogens. Yet, Wain was not using drugs. He was simply losing his mind. The psychiatrists who treated him preserved these drawings. Today, this series, known as Kaleidoscopic Cats, has reached classic status. It serves as a unique visual chronicle of a disintegrating consciousness. We can literally witness how schizophrenia consumed his mind, turning reality into a complex, eerie, yet captivating pattern. The most astounding part is that his technique and understanding of light not only did not deteriorate, but instead grew even more masterful. Illness did not strip him of his talent. It merely altered his perspective. Louis Wain, in the year 1939, continued to create art until the end of his days. He drew his peculiar, vibrant cats, which observed the world through a lens of madness. And you know what? A half-century before the emergence of psychedelic culture in the 60s, before the hippies and LSD, this quiet English artist in the asylum had already illustrated everything they were trying to perceive. He simply viewed the world a bit differently. Story number 26. A battle won by cheese. War is often associated with steel, gunpowder, and blood, but occasionally, albeit very rarely, it revolves around dairy products. The year is 1846. In Uruguay, civil war rages on, with the government troops known as Blancos on one side and the rebel forces called Colorados on the other, supported by the Argentine fleet under the command of Admiral William Brown. Brown was a legend, an Irishman serving Argentina, the scourge of the seas. He blockaded the capital city of Montevideo from the sea, while the rebels besieged the city from the land. The situation was dire for the defenders. Meanwhile, on the Uruguay River was another legendary figure, Giuseppe Garibaldi, who would later become the founding father of United Italy. At that time, he was merely a mercenary fighting for the Uruguayan government. Garibaldi commanded a small flotilla of 3 ships, tasked with breaking the blockade. The two fleets encountered each other near the town of Costa Brava. Admiral Brown had 7 large, well-armed ships, while Garibaldi had 3 small schooners and a handful of Italian volunteers. The odds were entirely against them. The battle commenced, but it quickly did not go according to Garibaldi's plan. Argentine cannons were decimating his vessels. One of his ships ran aground. The ammunition was running low. Defeat seemed inevitable. Realizing that capture was imminent, Garibaldi gave the order to scuttle the ships. No one else would claim them. However, there was not enough gunpowder left to create a significant explosion. One of his soldiers, a former merchant, shouted, "Comandante, we have cheese!" It might sound absurd, but in the holds of Garibaldi's ships, along with weapons, he was transporting supplies, which included hundreds of wheels of hard, sun-dried cheese, the kind that could be used to drive nails. The Italians began loading their cannons with cheese. Imagine the look on Admiral Brown's face when, instead of lethal cannonballs, wheels of cheese began striking his ships. At first, the Argentines probably laughed, but soon humor turned to disbelief. These stone-like cheese projectiles, launched from close range, pierced hulls and toppled masts just as effectively as iron cannonballs. Plus, they had a powerful odor. But the real trick lay elsewhere. Garibaldi commanded his men to ignite the remaining gunpowder and resin to create a smoke screen. As the Argentines coughed from the smoke and dodged the flying cheese, the Italians abandoned their weapons, leaped into the water, and swam to shore, where they vanished into the woods. Brown captured 3 empty, burning ships, smelling of both gunpowder and Parmesan. Garibaldi saved all of his men. He lost the battle, but won the war for survival. He humiliated the great admiral by bombarding his fleet with food. Later, when Garibaldi had already become a national hero of Italy, he was known to enjoy recounting this story, adding, "Never fight an Italian who has run out of bullets but still has cheese left. That's dangerous." Story number 27. The man who accidentally invented potato chips. We tend to believe that great inventions are the result of prolonged effort, flashes of insight, and sleepless nights in a lab. However, sometimes a brilliant idea is born not from inspiration, but from sheer, concentrated irritation. In 1853, in the resort town of Saratoga Springs, New York, there was a restaurant named Moonsley Lodge. The chef there was George Crumb, a man of strong character, half Native American and half African American. He was known for 2 things, his culinary talent and his quick temper. He could not stand it when anyone criticized his food. That evening, a particularly fussy customer dined at the restaurant. According to one version, it was none other than the railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt. He ordered the house specialty, French fried potatoes. Crumb prepared it perfectly, as usual. The waiter brought the plate. A minute later, he returned to the kitchen. "Chef, the customer is unhappy," he said. "The potatoes are cut too thick." Crumb frowned, but made a new batch, slicing the potatoes thinner. The waiter came back again. "Chef, he complains again. It's still too thick." At this point, Crumb exploded. "Oh, it's too thick for him?" he growled. "I'll make them so thin he won't even be able to pick them up with a fork." This was revenge, a sophisticated culinary revenge. He took the sharpest knife and began to slice the potatoes, turning them into nearly transparent, paper-thin pieces. He tossed them into boiling oil and fried them until they were crispy. Then he pulled them out and, with a touch of mockery, generously sprinkled them with salt before sending the waiter back out. "Here, take this, let him choke on it," he threw after him. Crumb braced for a scandal, expecting the wealthy man to storm into the kitchen yelling. But instead, the waiter returned with a beaming face. "Chef, he loves them," he said. "He ordered another serving." Unbeknownst to him, the troublesome customer had become the world's first taster of potato chips. What had been intended as a culinary insult turned out to be a brilliant discovery. Other diners, seeing what the magnate was enjoying, wanted to try this crispy treat as well. Crumb reluctantly prepared more and more. By the end of the evening, Saratoga chips, as they came to be known, had become the restaurant's top hit. George Crumb never patented his invention, thinking it was foolishness. However, he entered history as the man who proved that sometimes, to create something great, you simply need to get very, very angry. So the next time you open a bag of chips, remember that you're not just eating potatoes, you're tasting revenge. Very delicious revenge. Story number 28. The Man Who Heard Trees Growing. Science is about instruments, formulas, graphs, objectivity, and dispassion. Yet, occasionally, the greatest discoveries are made not by machines, but by humans who can literally listen. At the beginning of the 20th century, in India, an extraordinary man named Jagdish Chandra Bose lived and worked as a physicist, biologist, archaeologist, writer, and a veritable one-man band. At that time, the scientific community believed that plants were merely mechanisms, automatons. They grow, reach for light, and absorb water, but they possess neither feelings nor a nervous system. They do not live in the same way that we do. The boss regarded this as nonsense. "If I pinch you, you will scream," he told his colleagues. "If I pinch a plant, it will scream too. We just cannot hear it." They laughed at him. "Indian tales," whispered the British professors. However, the boss was not just a poet. He was a brilliant engineer. He thought to himself, "If the world cannot hear plants, then we need to create a microphone for them." And he did just that. He invented a device he named the chrysograph. This was an incredibly sensitive lever system capable of amplifying the smallest movements by 10 million times. If the tip of a plant moved 1/1,000,000th of an inch, the needle on the device would deflect several feet. Thus, he began his experiments. He attached sensors to leaves, stems, and roots, and the world was astonished. On a giant screen where the chrysograph's needle was projected, people saw, for the first time in history, the pulse of plants. They witnessed how a plant quivered when a match was lit nearby, how it grew weary by evening and fell asleep, and how it reveled in a sip of water. But the most shocking experiment was the auditory one. The boss connected his device to a speaker. He took a carrot and slowly lowered it into boiling water. From the speaker came a piercing, high-pitched sound resembling a cry of pain. The audience froze. People could hear with their own ears how a vegetable died. He went further. He proved that plants responded to music, that they could become intoxicated from alcohol fumes and could be poisoned, dying in convulsions that his device recorded. He demonstrated that plants possess a very slow, yet entirely real nervous system. His presentations at the Royal Society in London created a sensation. Newspapers wrote, "An Indian scientist made mute plants speak of their suffering." Jagdish Chandra Bose was 50 years ahead of his time. He proved what is today validated by complex technology. Plants are intricate, sensitive organisms. He didn't just invent a device. He gave a voice to those who had been silent for millions of years, prompting us to ponder just how vast the divide is between us and the humble ficus on the windowsill. Perhaps it also listens to our conversations. Story number 29. The Island That Fought Against Itself. When we think of war, we imagine armies, countries, and ideologies. However, the story of the island of Grunart, located off the coast of Scotland, shows that sometimes the most dreadful war is the war against oneself. 1942. The Second World War is in full swing. The British government is searching for new methods to destroy the enemy. Powerful weapons are needed. Terrifying weapons. A group of scientists in protective suits arrives on Grunart. They bring with them bombs, but unusual ones. These bombs contain anthrax. They detonate the bombs over the island. The sheep brought in for the experiment die a painful death within a few days. The experiment was successful. The British proved that anthrax is an ideal biological weapon. She kills swiftly, effectively, and leaves the land tainted for years to come. But the war is over. The project has been terminated. Grunhart Island was abandoned, and from there, the nightmare began. Anthrax spores can survive in the soil for decades. They destroy all living things. On Grunhart, no grass grew, no birds flew, and there were no insects. It was a dead zone, erased from existence. The government of the United Kingdom declared, "The island is closed forever. Entry is prohibited under the penalty of death." A sign with a skull and crossbones was erected on the shore. And then they arrived, a group of Scottish nationalists. They named themselves Operation Dark Reaper. Their mission was to compel the government to cleanse the island. In 1986, they secretly landed on Grunhart and collected hundreds of soil samples infected with anthrax. What did they do next? They mailed these samples via the post. They sent this deadly cargo in envelopes throughout the United Kingdom, to the Ministry of Defense, to the Prime Minister's residence at 10 Downing Street. Imagine the panic when letters began to be opened in London, spilling forth deadly dust. Fortunately, no one died. But the British government realized the time for joking was over. If the spores got into the ventilation system, if they were aerosolized in the subway, it would be a disaster. Only then did the authorities take desperate measures. They spent millions of pounds. They brought thousands of tons of formaldehyde onto the island. They doused the soil with this poison for years. In 1990, after nearly 50 years of quarantine, Grunhart Island was declared clean. The grass turned green again. The birds returned. But the most frightening aspect of this story isn't the bacteria or the bombs, but the fact that it took a small group of enthusiasts risking the lives of millions by disseminating the contagion through the mail to understand the scale of the tragedy. Sometimes, the worst enemy is not an external force. It is our own folly, compounded by good intentions. Story number 30. The ship that was too proud to sail. Well, here we are at the finish line. 30 stories, 30 scars on the body of time that we don't often speak about aloud. And for the finale, I have something special. Not a tale of a hero or a villain, but a story about pride. A pride so colossal and heavy that it sank itself. On the 10th of August in the year 1628, Stockholm. The air is buzzing with anticipation. The port smells of fresh tar, gunpowder, and celebration. Crowds have filled the waterfront. The very king of Sweden, Gustav II Adolf, the Lion of the North, stands in a place of honor. Today, he launches his dream, his weapon, his pride into the water. The ship Vasa. It was not just a vessel, it was a floating palace of death. The largest, most powerful, and lavishly adorned warship the world had ever seen. Hundreds of gilded and painted sculptures, lions, mermaids, Roman emperors, 2 full gun decks, 64 heavy bronze cannons cast with the cutting-edge technology of the time. Vasa was meant to become the terror of the Baltic Sea, a symbol of Swedish might. And now, it was casting off from the docks. Slowly and majestically, amidst the cheers of the crowd and the booming of cannons, he makes his way to the center of the harbor. The crew raises the sails, just 4 out of 10, merely to catch a light breeze. The ship travels 100 meters. The first gust of wind arrives. It is neither a storm nor a gale, simply a typical summer breeze that creates ripples on the water. The Vasa tilts slightly to the left. Nothing to worry about, it rights itself. It moves another 200 meters. A second gust, somewhat stronger than the first, arises. And the Vasa, the pride of the nation, a marvel of engineering, begins to lean over slowly, almost lazily, as if a tired hippopotamus decided to lie down for a rest. The crowd on the shore falls silent. The lower cannon ports, hastily left open, sink below the surface. Tons of water rush inside. Before the eyes of the king, the ambassadors, admirals, and thousands of townsfolk, the mightiest ship in the world, without firing a single shot at the enemy, and having not even traveled a mile and a half on the calm waters of its home port, simply lies down to rest on the seabed. It sank in perfect weather. Approximately 30 people perished within 20 minutes of its first and last departure. Yet the greatest casualty was the reputation of an entire empire. Why? Why did it sink? Because the king was too greedy for glory, and no one dared to oppose him. Originally, the ship was intended to have a single gun deck, but when Gustav Adolf learned that the Danes were building a new powerful ship, he commanded, "I want 2 decks and more cannons." The builders and engineers recognized that the ship was becoming too tall, narrow, and heavy on top, making it unstable. However, arguing with the Lion of the North was tantamount to suicide. They simply constructed what they were ordered to. The Vasa was too proud to sail. The laws of physics proved stronger than the laws of the king. For 333 years, it lay forgotten and disgraced at the bottom of Stockholm Harbor, until it was raised in the 20th century. Today, it remains the only intact sailing ship from the 15th century in the world. It stands in a museum as an eternal testament that even the greatest dreams, overloaded with pride, are doomed to sink. That is all. My archives are closed for today, but remember, the world is full of such stories. They hide in old newspapers, in footnotes of textbooks, in family legends. One must simply learn to listen for them. Because the most incredible stories are not those we fabricate, but those we have simply forgotten.